I'm pleased to be joined today with a very special guest, Mark Karris. Now, Dr. Karris is a licensed marriage and family therapist who's in full-time private practice in San Diego, California. He specializes in, among other things, religious trauma, as well as men's issues and couples therapy. And he's written several books, and his most recent one is this fascinating title, The Diabolical Trinity. Mark, it's great to have you joining us. What is the diabolical Trinity?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. And the diabolical trinity is, well, I wanted to write a book on the trauma of hell indoctrination. Not only did it's part of my own story and worked through a lot of that myself, but a lot of the clients that I work with, and even, online and social media communities, it was sort of a thing. So I wanted to really tackle that. It was unique from my other books because I wanted to try to write it for the person who wanted nothing to do with Christianity. So whereas my book before, okay, so I'm a sort of process panentheistic Christian, I don't like labels, but throw me in some kind of progressive camp, that's fine. But this book, it was challenging because I couldn't necessarily use any God talk except to maybe deconstruct some God talk. So that was an interesting endeavor in itself. But the diabolical trinity, I came to realize after wrestling through these concepts that it was sort of the trifold nature of these doctrines that were interrelated, because you can't have a hell, well, a hell with eternal conscious torment without a wrathful God who created it. And you can't have a hell without sinful and evil and depraved human beings to be put there. So it just sort of fit. It's just this trifold nature of doctrines that formulate what I consider sort of hell indoctrination.
Okay, so the diabolical trinity is the concept of a wrathful God, totally depraved human beings, and an eternal conscious torment to
Yeah,
put a subset of those human beings after death.
sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you focus on religious trauma.
Mm-hmm.
How do doctrines like this bring about religious trauma in people? I know it's a huge question.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
your book comes in three parts. The first part is what hell does to us, and you begin to unpack
Mm,
some of the psychological impact of the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. So I guess
yeah.
really the question is, let's explore that. I want to
Mm-hmm.
begin by just giving an introduction
Sure.
quote. So, as you know, I recently wrote a critique of a book by Alyssa Childers. Her book was called Another Gospel. She talks in that book about growing up in a conservative
Mm,
Protestant household, and she reflects on learning about the doctrine of hell at a young age. And she says that her second grade Sunday school teacher taught them about hell. She said, "In everyone in the class is at least 7 years old. Did you know," the teacher said, "that 7 is the age of accountability? That means that if by 7 years old you haven't received Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, you will be on fire in hell forever while worms slowly eat your flesh for all eternity." That's what she recalls, like 40
mm-hmm.
years later, I guess, from
Mm,
this second grade Sunday school class. It clearly had an impact on her. What have you learned about the
yeah,
psychological impact of the doctrine of hell and the related doctrines to it?
sure. Well, let's start off with a little bit of a definition of religious trauma. I think that may be helpful. And this is coming from the Religious Trauma Institute and Reclamation Collective. There's a big push in with religious trauma specialists, practitioners, to try to get more of an academic understanding, a more research-based understanding of religious trauma. And so, yeah, I know many books that will be coming out in the next year. It's this sort of big phenomenon. And actually, one of the biggest studies of religious trauma came out a few weeks ago by the Global Center for Religious Research. So, religious trauma, the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that is experienced by an individual as overwhelming or disruptive and has, and here's the key, lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So when it comes to the hell indoctrination and the interrelated um, doctrines around that, I discuss in the first part of how it does affect, and I talk about the debilitating anxiety. There's a little bit of research that came out. One was a study by Baylor University, and there's not much research on this, but the little that there is, it makes sense for a person to, well, for some people to believe in a wrathful God who has so much power that at a snap of God's finger, that God can, well, cause physical pain in the here and now, because if we, well, as we've read in the Old and some aspects of the New Testament, God can do that kind of thing. But then with this belief that God can send you to hell for eternity, and I like your sort of framing of it, that it is a sort of, it's torture, right? It is eternal torture, that it creates a lot of anxiety. I mean, it would be likened to, if a child was with a father who was very physically abusive, and every time that father's name was mentioned or that father came home, there would be this sort of anxiety that would ripple through their nervous system. Makes perfect sense, right? So between anxiety, then the effects on the body itself, with that level of hotbed of stressful glucocorticoids and neurochemicals throughout many years, of what that can do to people. Now, it may seem strange because there's like, one person's theological treasure is another person's noxic, traumatic trash. Some people have no ill effects, but some people, and this can be shown out in the qualitative literature on the de-churched, those who have moved away from the church or those who have experienced religious trauma. I mean, panic attacks, hypervigilance, increase in triggers. So, I just worked with someone this week that's even something on Facebook they could read from a distant friend about God or hell, it throws them into a complete tailspin. And when I mean the pain, and I see them with tears in their eyes and this panic, this is real stuff. This isn't made up. This isn't just, us making a big deal out of nothing. There are some people who have traumatic effects of this kind of stuff, but then throw in the interrelated concept of original sin, or an understanding that humans are primarily evil or sinful. Then let's talk about shame. And does shame, the sense that I am no good, this sense that I am so no good and unworthy that I might as well be a kind of rag doll that can be thrown in the fires of hell. I mean, so that gets into the effects of original sin and human depravity and shame. I suck. I'm no good. God hates me. The community hates me. I'm never going to be a Christian. It's also tied to self-criticism. So shame could be that heavy feeling that you just want to collapse and just affects your whole self and view of self, but it's also related to view of others. And so just, yeah, shame, self-criticism, body, throw in there the teachings of purity culture, and people feel tainted. People feel that they literally will go to hell because maybe they had sex before marriage. I've met people who would masturbate and would be in this frantic, anxiety-ridden state that God would seriously punish them in some way, and not only in the here and now, but in the afterlife as well. In my experience, I remember being at a picnic. It was a United Pentecostal Church picnic, and there was a guy there who said he got kicked out of the church for masturbating. I was like, oh my God, what could happen to me? I was a young guy, and but it wasn't like he was doing it in a way that was harming other people. He just acknowledged that, he would masturbate once in a while, and that in and of itself was enough to be kicked out of the church and to kind of be in danger of hellfire. So there's a lot of effects like that. I could go on. I think I'm being long-winded here. Just a few more. One is betrayal trauma. And that is what I find is people are awakened as they emerge from this very fundamentalist, conservative, strict understanding of God. And they say, oh my goodness, I was in relationship with this God who is punitive, who wanted to harm me in some way in this life or the next, just because I was imperfect or I would sinned or missed the mark in some way. And then they feel traumatized because of that. It was like being a domestic abuse victim and realizing, no, you were really in an abusive relationship. And then it took them a long time to get out of that, to extract themselves from that entanglement. And so this sense of betrayal and disorientation in the world. Who is God? Who am I? What is life about? And then the last one I'll just mention is communal rejection. And that is when people have started asking questions about, well, if God is so good, then how could God do that? How, like, I couldn't even stand my dog being tormented for, 30 seconds. I mean, for billion, zillion, eternity, that's hard. But when people start questioning, then you get the communal rejection, the in and out crowd, you're hanging out in cahoots with Satan, and who else questioned God's word, right? And so they link them with connecting with Satan, then connecting with the curses of God. And I feel like I could be overwhelming people with this, but it is overwhelming for many people. So I'll just pause there. Yeah.
So that excerpt I read from Childers, she describes the teacher saying the age of accountability is 7 years old. And so then you get in many Christian churches appeals to things like Anselm's justification for hell. They likely won't know it was Anselm, but this idea that when you sin against an infinite God, that is an infinite offense because of his honor. You've offended against the infinite honor of an infinite God, and that's warranting an infinite punishment. So then you get the logic that a 7-year-old who commits just the most mundane of sins or errors, whatever, immoral actions, that they have thereby sinned against God, much as David said he sinned against God when he sinned against Uriah and Bathsheba and the nation in Psalm 51. And that now warrants for that 7-year-old an infinity of torture, which is just a crazy calculus. But if you're inculcated in that tradition, it makes sense from the inside. I just want to
God
read,
is just.
And our understanding of that justice is flawed, right? So we've got a rationalizing framework there for it. But here's a passage, an excerpt from the book that impacted me in the first part. You said, choosing to no longer believe in original sin and hell is like trying to tell the brain after a lion attack that happened years ago. You remember that ferocious lion? Well, that really wasn't a lion. So say a little bit more about that, about the impact that these kinds of experiences, I'm going to say indoctrination in many cases, can have on a person, and how even when long after you've ostensibly rejected a particular doctrinal framework, it can still haunt you.
Yeah, it's so true. Two things, if I may just backtrack for a minute. The 7-year-old kind of concept, I struggle with that because people have said that we're born into sin. So I've heard it, from an understanding that since we are born into sin, we are sinners. So I don't know what then keeps a baby from being judged to be in hell for eternity. So I don't know about 7, but to take that theological understanding to its logical conclusion, if God hates sinners and we are going to hell for eternity because God is so holy and just that we can't even be in God's presence, God can only look at us through the prism of Jesus, then a child, a baby, then it makes sense that a child and baby would be in eternity being tormented as well. I don't see what keeps them from not. So that's one thing. But the aspect of hell trauma, I can say personally for myself, and I think I mentioned this phrase in the book, phantom limb syndrome, where a person who loses a limb can feel as if it is still there in some ways. And so, likened to me, who no longer believed in eternal conscious torment, I still, for years, I couldn't get away from it in my nervous system. Even I think I wrote this in the book, when I was writing a particular chapter, I had some fears come up that was saying something like, Mark, you shouldn't be doing this. People might go to hell. I'm like, who is this? That gets into an interesting conversation about the inner critic, and as some have thought about it as far as demons, but that's a whole other conversation. But this understanding that sufferers of hell trauma like myself, we were told by those in authority, God's mouthpieces, that God thinks we are depraved sinners deserving to be tortured for all eternity. And so it was simply hard to forget those instances and the traumatic shock of fear that rushed through our nervous system. And it does leave that like if someone touched a hot stove, it'd be like your brain says, shoot, don't touch the hot stove again. And so it also leaves a mark once we hear that in Elisa Childers, and I've heard that many times from people who were taught that as young children. It left an indelible mark on the nervous system, formed in a traumatic memory that had lasting consequences and effects for some even decades later. That shows the violence of such a belief. One can say, well, it's true. Yeah, but what if it's not? And what if God is more beautiful and more loving and a much wiser, loving, compassionate disciplinarian than us human beings and the gurus and scholars of child discipline today? Then people are causing serious harm to people's mental, emotional, and spiritual well-beings with these kind of doctrines.
Well, I think at this point of Jesus in Matthew 7 in the Sermon on the Mount, where he talks about judging by the fruit that is produced, when he's distinguishing between true and false prophets. And likewise, you could extend that principle to evaluating interpretations of doctrine. So you referenced the trauma comes from lasting adverse effects upon a person of a doctrine. It can create this trauma. And is it fair to say it's a reasonable criterion that insofar as a particular interpretation of doctrine propagated in the church creates a lasting adverse effect upon people, such that they are traumatized, terrorized by a doctrine, then all things being equal, that's a good reason to doubt that interpretation of the doctrine? And in contrast, to the extent to which a doctrine has positive benefits upon people rather than traumatizing them, that's all things being equal, a good reason to judge it positively by its fruitful impact upon the person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. That whole understanding of the fruits makes so much sense. And maybe someone could say, well, Mark, some things can be true and have, adverse effects. Like there could be some things about God that it's just hard to be palatable, I don't know. So I want to be open to that. But the nature of these kinds of truths, it seems so violent. It seems so contrary to who God is. It seems contrary to the fruit of the Spirit. It seems contrary to who Jesus was, how he lived, what Jesus emphasized. And I think of the first sermon that Jesus ever preached, which really informs my work as a therapist. I say, well, Jesus, why was the Spirit upon you? Like, what's your whole deal, dude? Like, and I know he's quoting from, I believe, Isaiah in the Old Testament, but the Spirit is upon me to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. What's interesting, warning people of eternal conscious torment is not one of the reasons why the Spirit was upon him, but the violent traumatic consequences of these doctrines seems to have nothing to do with setting people free and releasing the oppressed and giving people new sight to see the beauty and love and incredible goodness of God.
So what are some of the functions of the doctrine of eternal conscious torment? How does it work within the church as you've observed it?
This gets into part 2 of my book, which is trying to wiggle hell beliefs from people's minds, because there's a difference between, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about stuff that's in the neuronal tracts, that's in the nervous system, the subcortical nervous system, not the prefrontal cortex, the logical part of our brain. So I do wrestle with some just ideas that hopefully can wiggle some of our hell beliefs, but I do get into some of the functions and looking at sort of the sociology of religion and the psychology of religion. What function would this have if like God didn't design this, which I say, by the way, in the book? It's like, something is amiss when the original story where Adam and Eve fell or sinned or slipped on the banana, it wasn't a banana, whatever kind of fruit it was, that there was no mention of eternal conscious torment. Like, you'd figure the original sin, where the original consequences were meted out, you'd figure God would say something about, hey, this is what's going to happen to humankind. But if it wasn't in that story, then one would have to ask, where in the evolutionary program here did this narrative of a punitive God is going to send people to hell for eternity even come about? But what I like to do is look at, why does this stuff exist? First of all, does it exist in other religious narratives? And if so, why? It's such an interesting question to like kind of take a step back and say, why has these narratives, which, first of all, religion is ubiquitous. Wherever you are in the world, religion is there. But then just about as ubiquitous a religion is an understanding of an afterlife where either the ancestors can be mad at you and thus be some consequences if you do the wrong thing in this life, or there's some sort of deity that will be mad at you and can punish you for. So I say there's something to that. First of all, looking at the beauty of humans' creativity, because there's all kinds of beliefs, whether it's Egyptian, whether it's Hindu, whether it's Buddhist, everyone's coming up with stuff about the afterlife. So I like to just like think about that. Like, humans are so creative. They're so curious that they're just spitting out these kinds of things. So it's something within humans that need to create and craft these. But to make a long story short, I think that the fostering of these kinds of narratives, not only do they help the existential angst and anxieties that we feel as human beings in a world full of chaos and trauma in and of itself, thus having some afterlife narratives would be very soothing. Not only that, but there is a communal aspect that they do become a sort of sacred glue that binds communities together and do promote a homogeneous, framework for morality, thus saying, this is who we are, we're not them. And if you stray from who we are, not only could it be a death sentence, because anyone back in the day, if you just went apart from the tribe, it basically was a death sentence. But to think that, oh, I better keep this rule, because if I don't, not only will the community be mad at me, but there could be a deity who could punish me. I'm going to be more prone to, that carrot and the stick thing. That stick's going to have some weight. So there is a communal sociological function, I think, of religion. It's ubiquitous. Afterlife narratives are ubiquitous. Punishing deities or ancestors is ubiquitous. There's a reason for that. Not sure it's divine origins as much as it is human origins.
I mean, here's a trite example. If like father doesn't want his kids to go into the basement where he's got all his antique Star Wars collection of collectibles or whatever, he tells them there's a boogeyman in the basement and they're not going down there. So the fear uh, develops what is for the father pro-social behavior. And so we can kind of
Mhm.
create that within the Christian community through the fear of hell and torment. What about, I want to read a quote for you
Hmm.
from Tertullian. This is, so one of the big things about the doctrine of hell is how it gets linked to Schadenfreude, to the idea of taking, like, if this is the exemplification of God's righteous judgment, then if you are on the side of heaven, then you should be taking pleasure in God's righteous judgment visited upon the wicked, which
Hmm. Hmm.
soon cultivates some pretty scary attitudes. So this is Tertullian.
Hmm.
He's talking
Hmm.
about those who were persecuting Christians in North Africa at the time, early third century, under the Emperor Septimus Severus, and in the early 200s. So he
Hmm.
says, "You are fond of spectacles. Expect the greatest of all spectacles, the last and eternal judgment of the universe. How shall I admire, how laugh, how rejoice, how exult when I behold so many proud monarchs and fancied gods groaning in the lowest abyss of darkness? So many magistrates who persecuted the name of the Lord, liquefying in fiercer fires than they ever kindled against Christians." And he goes
Hmm.
on through all these different groups like philosophers and dancers, tragedians, and others, kind of in this very perverse way, frankly, it looks to me, just exulting in the fact that they will all be tortured forever. And the Christian will observe this as the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever.
Yes.
What does this doctrine of hell do to people and how they think about God and how they think about one another?
Yeah. Can I just go back because you said something really important with that. I went just the other day, I went to look at some of the top passages in the New Testament, well, a couple from the Old, where those who believe in eternal conscious torment, that's their sort of well-worn verses. And what I came to find is just about every single one of them. And I asked myself, well, what would be if you just looked at sort of the psychological, sociological function of them? I did find something interesting. One thing I didn't point out that you just alluded to is another function would be to offer encouragement to those who are traumatized and oppressed by other people groups, right?
Mhm.
And so I looked at some of those verses that Jesus was talking about, or Isaiah 66, or Daniel 12, verse 1 and 2. And it's like, yes, they're trying to encourage these traumatized God lovers that this fate of being oppressed will not have the last word. And so there's an interesting function there of sort of this encouragement to sort of help these people have some hope in that way. But I also saw that one was also, if you look at those verses in the New Testament, they're also linked to morality, to really encouraging, whether it's the, what was that verse? If your eye causes you to sin, um, pluck it out. And then it talks about sort of a notion of eternity. So I thought that
Hmm.
was interesting.
Hmm.
But so the function of hell, just to have that conversation is interesting, but the ramifications on it for a relationship with God, this is one of the aches that I have is, I think one of the top issues that people have with God, and if one is an atheist or one have distanced themselves from God, is the issue of theodicy in general, but also theodicy is directly linked to the image of God. I think, and it saddens me, I would have, okay, let me take a step back. I would have been more open to hell if I would have heard, and I get emotional thinking about this because I mean, year after year, I was fed, it was shoved down my throat. God despises me. I'm a sinner every week at the Pentecostal church I was in. No judgment of Pentecostals. Maybe they've changed. It was a long time ago. But, like I was depraved. Like I could never be good enough. I could never win God's heart. And I was like, at some point, I'm like, I thought Jesus saved me. Like, but no, I had to like win God's favor in some way. And God, I felt was always ready to pounce on me. And they talked about hell and eternity and eternal conscious torment. But after writing this book, I thought, I'm more open to hell now, which is so interesting. If somebody came to me as a Christian and said, Mark, God loves you, God loves everybody, God's love is non coercive, God is constantly, moment to moment, luring us towards ever greater increase of beauty, goodness, truth, all that wonderful stuff, that even in eternity, that God is not going to control anyone, that we do have free will, and that God has designed a place. Now, I don't think it's called hell because it's coming from Gehenna, but could there be a place where God says, listen, if you don't want to be with me, if my presence is aversive to you in some way, you can stay here and I will be loving. I will be uncoercive. If you invite me in, I could share some things about who I really am. If you have questions about your life and what happened back then, I'd love to. Like, that's so inviting to me. I'm like, that I could buy into a hell or a destination, and maybe there could be people, like I think of dogs, traumatized dogs, where I literally would go up to them and I was like so loving and kind. I just wanted to pet them. And they would come at me with gnashing of teeth, with wanting to just, I'm like, what is that? So could there be something to that effect in the afterlife, in the sense where some people are so traumatized that even though God could be really loving, that they have this aversive effect due to trauma? Perhaps. All that to say is the image of God is so important. We should take it with such sacredness. We could cause harm, or we could, infuse horror. It's,
I think
yeah.
we need to just take a moment to unpack that. I think it's a really fecund illustration. So I'm a big fan of the Dodo, which you can see
Mm.
on
Ah,
YouTube and also Twitter, and they post videos of, encouraging, uplifting stories of animals relating to one another and human beings. And one common story I've
yeah.
seen on many Dodo videos will be like a traumatized dog. Let's say a pit bull. The only thing they'd
Ah,
ever known was fighting in the
yep.
in the ring, and then they're dropped off at an animal shelter, and they're going to be, it's a kill shelter or something, and some person adopts them, but they're terrified. They just want to stay in the cage, the one place they feel safe. And so what
Yeah.
they do is they let them stay in the cage, and they just put the food and water in one corner of the cage every day. And then eventually they slowly come in, and then eventually the dog allows them to pat their head. And by the end of the 4-minute video, which of course is encapsulated 10 months or whatever it is, they're running and playing with the other dogs. And if that was what hell is that we've been damaged and we're allowed to stay in the cage for as long as we need to, as God slowly
Mhm.
works to restore us to favor with himself and ourselves and one another. That's a very
Mhm.
different picture than the punitive dungeon of terror.
I fully agree. Yes.
Now, I
Mhm.
want to say this big piece of part two of the book, which you referenced, that there's this
Okay.
part two, um, is you offer a projection thesis.
Ah,
And
yes.
I projection theses, of course, famously were first really promoted by Ludwig Feuerbach in the mid 19th century. His idea sort of carrying through a Hegelian critique of religion to its, in one sense, a logical secular end, where we actually, God doesn't create us, we create God. We project God onto the universe because we
Mhm.
can't. It's kind of Linus's security blanket for the human species. And you don't take that view, but you offer a modified projection thesis where you propose that certain doctrines or interpretations of doctrine should best be interpreted within that rubric. So I'll quote you, page 86. You say, "Isn't it probable that the angry, punitive, and torturing God and horrific hell described in the Bible and taught by preachers are merely projections of the unbearable emotional feelings, wishes, desires, and urges that exist within us?" So we're, in essence, making God in our image. Say a
Mm,
bit more
mhm.
about that, but also how you avoid falling into the trap of a slippery slope where you end up with the Feuerbachian conclusion that all Christian doctrine is simply a projection.
Oh man. I um I think it is all. I might be closer if you're back in that there is a sense for me, if I was honest, it is all projection. Um, I have to come to that conclusion. Now, there's some caveats. So, like I said, wherever we go in the world, there's hundreds of thousands of different deities. And, where is that coming from? It's coming from humans. Where is the, thousands upon thousands of genres of music or, millions of books? It's all humans. We love to create. So in that sense, I do have a deep sense that, like if we go to another continent, they have, I don't know if it's true, 12, 15 words for snow. So that's where social constructionism and projection for me comes into play. I think everything is projection
But
because
just to push back 1 second, I don't want to interrupt
yeah,
your thought, but I'm going to
no,
anyway.
please. We should
Uh,
wrestle. Yes.
the Inuit still, they may have 22 words, I think it is, that I've heard for snow,
Okay.
but there is such a thing as snow, and they are
Sure.
describing it with various degrees of nuance that for most of us we don't require. So I don't see.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, in a sense, it's. I don't want to undercut the point by saying it's trivial, but I do think there's a sense where it's trivial that all human knowing is human knowing. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an objective reality to be known. But if one
Yeah.
goes to a Feuerbachian approach, one is saying, no, the reality that we think we know is itself a construction. So I'm wondering
Yeah.
if you're saying
Got it.
that you take that view of all doctrine is
Okay.
all a
So good,
construction.
good point. I think if my memory serves me right, it could be the distinction between soft and hard postmodernism. So, yeah, I would say that there is an objective reality out there, but we only know through our knower. God is spirit. God is a disembodied spirit who doesn't have a vocal cords or a body apart from the body of Christ in that way. So we only have our knowers. And out of our knowers is we have objective reality filtered through our apparatus. Oh, what was the plural of apparatus? Anyway, that was a separate thing I was trying to figure out. The plural of apparati. So yeah, I agree with you there. And at the same time, we just love to create. We love to anthropomorphize everything, from God to creation, to our dogs. It's just a thing that we do. So for me, that just invites epistemological humility for me, because how could I say 100% that this is objective reality, especially about a God that we can't see? I just hold that a little bit more loosely. And so at the same time, I do believe that we're projecting on God. You look at the tribal deities, which some people still hold to God as a tribal deity, but it just makes sense. I do think there's an evolution. You might use the word progressive revelation, that, and then Jesus says, you may have heard this, well, I tell you this, in that sense. So there is this progression in our understandings of God. It just creates a lot of humility for me. I just don't know 100% much of anything. So when it comes to God, I'm a little bit more cautious. But I do know that it seems strange that God looks like the worst of humankind. That causes me to be cautious. If God looks like an amalgamation of if Hitler and Mao Zedong and Stalin, we have a problem.
Okay, so let's segue from there. That you say on page 90, you kind of, I think, tacitly give a criterion of appeal to deep-seated intuitions. So you say, if
Okay.
we're repelled by the idea of an angry, wrathful God who needs perfect blood to be content toward humans and to forgive them, then we should trust that intuition. So I think generally this is right. I mean, this is very much on track with my critique of particular readings of Canaanite genocide, for example, in my book, Jesus
Yeah.
Loves Canaanites. But I guess what I want to ask is, how do you apply the principle without going into the opposite error, where instead of having a projection of a cruel, malevolent deity that is the result of our worst projections, you end up with a fanciful deity, which is the equal and opposite error. It's likewise a projection of our limited fallible perspective.
Yeah, I agree. So first I start off with we're all projecting, including myself. I think it's just honest, it's intellectually honest. It's helpful to really be mindful of our projections. And, to be fair, I do see it on both ends, where there's something about I hate labels, but somewhere in the progressive camp, God is too loving, in the sense of too, I don't know, fluffy, tiptoeing in the tulips. There's something about it, and even with those who are against violence and read passages in a particular way, I just feel like I have a sense that people in the Old Testament, New Testament don't have our sensibilities when it comes to violence. I think they could be okay with saying God creates the good and God creates evil and have no problems with that. Maybe slightly. I know they did wrestle, and you get to Book of Job and stuff like that, but they had a little bit more ability that's just how it is. But I think sometimes we are shoving, projecting our sensibilities onto some, like, I just wish they would be raw. And yeah, Jesus did use violent language. And for me, it still feels not okay, to say that you're going to put a millstone on someone's neck and drown them. I don't know. I mean, that just, and the way of revelation, oh no, that's just metaphor. Jesus is not really doing any of the violence or the blood in the streets. And but the way they interpret is so there's no violence whatsoever. It's all metaphor. I just have a problem with that because it's so violent. Jesus seems like a hyper kick-ass Caesar in the book of Revelation. And to tell me, no, that's not the case, he is more the lamb than anything else. It just, again, it's cognitive bias, it's projecting. I think we're doing it on both sides.
Well, at the very least, I think what you're demonstrating here is we don't have to have all the answers, but we need to be able to have honest conversations about how we interact with the text. I always love to go back to the fact that Jacob was Israel, got the name Israel because he wrestled through the night with the angel.
Yeah.
And to be God's people is to be willing to wrestle with God and with the text that God has given us as we seek to better understand it.
Totally.
And that includes pushing back on things that, like you're saying, just seem to be fundamentally inimical to and inconsistent with what we believe to be who God is, or what we believe to be the goodness that we are called to extend toward others, and so on, so that we can recognize all those intuitions can be fallible. We're always open to critique, but nonetheless, we can also begin to proceed with some critical revisions in our thinking based upon the guidance of some of these intuitions. Part 3. So here we turn to how do we begin to overcome some of this trauma and find healing. Page 122, great passage here. You say, healing trauma requires putting on scuba gear and diving into the muddy waters of our complex internal systems. I have a scuba diving license, so that resonated with me. Tell me a little bit more about what that is going to look like as you begin to heal from the trauma of some of these unhelpful and indeed harmful and traumatizing understandings of eternal conscious torment, total depravity, and a wrathful deity.
Yeah. This is the really heart. This is my passion. I don't want to just deconstruct. I want to help people reconstruct and heal. So I spend over 120 pages, I believe, in part 3 to help people do that. And I think I've already heard from therapists, spiritual directors, coaches. It's very beneficial. And that makes me really encouraged. So in part 3, it is doing the work in the nervous system, where part 2 is more of wrestling with ideas. this is getting into the tracks. As I say, information does not necessitate transformation. So for me, the trauma of hell indoctrination is lodged in the tracks of the subcortical nervous system. And so because of that imprint, we need to do more experiential, emotion-focused, somatic-based work. For me, I'm very much informed with the current research on neuroscience. So how do I do that? Just in a broad brush, I'm going to be looking at a few things. The research around memory reconsolidation, doing imagery work, just broad brush, and I'll go narrow in, self-compassion work, inner critic work, working through parent wounds, because our parent wounds are sometimes inextricably connected to our religious trauma. I know they were for me, even though my parents were not religious. But I started to ask myself, well, I feel this aversion and trauma because God is cold and withdraws his presence if I do something wrong, and cannot be found and punitive. And I'm like, gosh, that's my dad. And so I had to really wrestle with that. And it's really interesting. It's not a conversation often talked about, but what I find is that people who have religious trauma, it's not all about how the church effed you up. There are wounds that have occurred before that somehow can be entangled. And so piecing that out can be really, really helpful for folks. And the last chapter is going to be dealing with values. So I don't know where we want to go, but I do, for example, if someone's dealing with hell indoctrination, whatever the trifold nature of that is, and whatever is causing a lot of hurt and consequences, we might do imagery work. So what that could look like, if someone is dealing with an image of a God who is punitive, well, I want to look at, how we can use the imagination, right? Because the brain is a fascinating thing that if it believes something, if it's real, it takes it up as if it is real. Studies of depression have shown that taking sugar pills can have an antidepressant effect if participants believe them to be genuine medication, right? So it's that. So how can I use that for the good? And that gets into helping them install, whether it's a peaceful place, whether it's a nurturing figure, a protective figure, or a wise figure. For example, if someone struggles with a memory where, let's say, they were at a Christian play, there were some of them that are very, explicit, and demons and God and who's going to hell and who's not. And some people were traumatized because of something like that. How can we go back in time within our minds? And how can I help you bring somebody back there? Whether it is, let's say, the image of God found in the prodigal son, or as I like to call it, the prodigal God, whether it's bringing in the prodigal God, wrathfully, wasteful, extravagant in God's love, or an ant, or Mufasa from The Lion King, whatever, to bring back into the memory, to bring some TLC. And there's a whole way to do that. But that's some of the ideas. But can I share one of the most powerful interventions, things that changed my life? And that is the research and practices around self-compassion.
Hmm.
I'm so thankful for my brothers and sisters from the East. I've sat through probably thousands of sermons. I've never once heard a sermon on 3 points to how to love yourself well. I just never heard it. It's not something that was really taught in the Christian communities I was a part of. But self-compassion, taking it out of any kind of religious framework, there's so much research around it. For me, it's so subversive. And just to be short, how can I treat myself as I would a dear friend who is suffering? So that there's so many different ways to incorporate that into our lives, but I feel like it's a subversive middle finger to the trauma of religious trauma, and of a punitive, angry God, or a punitive, angry community who says, I don't like you, you're a heretic, you're a sinner, you're destined for hell, there's nothing good that dwells within you, all your righteousness and goodness is as filthy rags. There's something to be said about, if you're going through a tough time, to put your hand on your heart and to acknowledge that this is a moment of suffering, linking it to common humanity, that other people suffer with religious trauma just like me, and then saying something that's self-compassionate. May I be well. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I know that I will get through this, and hell trauma won't have the last word. Not only can I release oxytocin by just bringing my hand to my heart and really tap into, we not only have a fight or flight system, but we also have a tend and befriend caregiving system that we can sort of trigger, that can give those neurochemicals of connection and warmth. So those are just different ways of helping people work through this kind of stuff.
That's excellent. I was thinking as you were speaking that actually Jesus commanded us to be compassionate to ourselves. That's one of his two greatest commands. It's embedded in there, right? He says, when he summarizes all of the law and the prophets, he says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, which means you extend compassion to your neighbor as you extend it to yourself. We are commanded to do exactly what you've described. There's so much in this way of thinking of hell and the trifecta, the diabolical trinity, as you put it, that is, I think, counter to human flourishing. I want to give you one quote that just came to mind from C.S. Lewis, and then I want to cycle back and ask you to give your final word, your quick synopsis as to what you think is a healthy way to think about God and the judgment of God and our status as human beings before God. So here's the quote from Lewis. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. It is immortals with whom we joke, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. And I've often heard that just cited as an example of how profound it is to be human, that we live forever. But what C.S. Lewis gives us there is a very bifurcated binary picture in which every human being you meet is either infinitely worse than you can imagine or infinitely better in their future destiny. And honestly, that's not a game I want to play in a sense. It's terrifying to think that, yeah, this child that you raised could be an immortal horror. The spouse you're married to could be an immortal horror. Your best friend, your parent, an immortal horror. You could be an immortal horror. It just hasn't been revealed yet. It's a pretty terrifying picture when you think about it, I believe, like that. So again, to come back to, what does it look like from your perspective? You're not a theologian, I get it, but there is a wonderful dovetailing of your own theological reflection with what you've learned in therapy. So from that perspective or that lens, what does it look like? What is it, a positive, beneficial understanding of God and our relation to God?
Yeah. I want to start off by saying that I can only be myself. And I understand that it's my image of God, or more my emphasis of God. You know, I think of the different members of the body of Christ. How can the hand say to the foot, I have no need of thee? I'm aware that some people can have a more, let's say, prophetic flair. Whether I have the gift of mercy or compassion, you know, being a therapist, I can only, and I say this not knowing 100% who God is, but this is based on my intuitions and based on my, even like say the Wesleyan quadrilateral, that God can't be worse than us. Like to be God would suppose that God looks way better than us. That must be included in our discipline. And so I do talk about like our compassion, goodness, and wise discipline meter. You know, it can't be better than God's. So I can understand there could be a place of judgment, but judgment must be preceded by such compassion, such love. It must be embodied by me as a father who, am I screwed up? in the sense that when my 6-year-old does something wrong, I don't think immediately of what violent physical punishment can do to help him learn a lesson. I don't know, whatever that is in me that says, hell no, that whatever I want to do next in his wrongdoing, in his sin, or missing the mark of the ideals of love, I would want to come at it through a lens of love, of discipline, in the truest sense of the form. How could he learn to be a wiser, more beautifully loving, compassionate person in the world? And I just don't think that violence is the way. I mean, there's research that, if we want to appeal to research, but it is just intuitive. So God must look like something like the prodigal father, who in our being immersed in pig shit, that God is looking, even if we're a long way off, waiting for us to come to him. The God who runs always to us, is always there. A God who hugs and kisses, like, that just blows my mind. That wasn't my image of God. But there's something about the beauty of one of that parabolic images that Jesus gives me, plus the life of Jesus, the hugger, the healer, the one who's fighting for the oppressed and are marginalized. That must look like God. And I can't settle for anything less than what constitutes beautiful, loving, good, and wise.
I think it's very well stated. We talk in theology about control texts. So you do get within the Bible different portraits of God and different texts that seem to support different doctrinal conclusions. And what you have to do as a theologian, and we're all systematic theologians, whether we recognize it or not, is to kind of bring these into harmony. And you have to then appeal to one set of texts as a control framework for another set of texts. And if I am given, for
Yeah.
example, an image of God as a warrior whose sword is drunk with blood versus God as a loving father who hikes up his robes and runs to embrace his son, I just know in my heart deeply which one of those seems more resonant with who I believe God to be and who I would want to be as a father, as you've said. So I think that is a good criterion
Yeah.
on which to proceed.
May I share one other criterion, which I call the pentalateral 5-part lens in which I look at God. So this is my hermeneutic. It helps me determine what passages for me may be culturally conditioned and sub-Christ-like portrayals of God. And so I look at this 5-part lens: one, the fruit of the Spirit; one, the biblical definition of love, 1 Corinthians 13; the other, the only explicit parabolic picture Jesus gave of God, the Father, found in the story of the prodigal son, prodigal father; 4, the perfect love described in Matthew 5; and the last one is the radical self-giving, others empowering life of Jesus Christ, who is the full revelation of God. So I have that 5-part criterion. It may seem strange to people, but I am a cherry picker, but I look at scriptures through that 5-part lens, and I say, God, if it feels that it's contrary to any of those 5 parts, it may be a culturally conditioned sub-Christ, sub-portrayal. Yeah, I don't know. That's just where I'm coming from.
At the very least, I think what you're showing us is we all need to be thinking and reflecting on our own hermeneutic as we seek to make sense of these texts as well,
Yeah.
and find ways to understand doctrine that does not lead to religious trauma. Because as you said, you gave a caveat early on. It's always possible that something could be true and yet traumatizing to an individual in a circumstance. But generally, right, that I think we're well advised to be duly
Yeah.
skeptical of doctrines or interpretations of doctrine that tend to cultivate traumatizing effects in people, which do
Yeah.
not enable them to either love God and or themselves or neighbor more greatly. And I think what we've
Yeah.
heard from you today is, for many people, these doctrines, the way that eternal conscious torment in particular is understood, does not tend to lead to a heightened love of God, neighbor, or ourselves. So for everybody, The Diabolical Trinity. This is a really important book. I very much enjoyed it. It's getting a lot of buzz. I'm just going to read on the back from Brian McLaren. It says, this is a brilliant book on healing from hell-related religious trauma. Highly recommends it. And there's a long list of other endorsers for the book as well. Check it out. I'm including a link below, as well as a link to Mark's website. So Mark, thank you very much for
Wonderful.
joining us today. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you, Randall.